We are about to hear from Derek Hodgson. And Professor Hodgson is in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. And he's going to speak about the visual brain, embodiment, and the first visual cultures. What can they tell us about art?
Thank you. I'd just like to start off by thanking Joanna Drucker, the Minerva Foundation, and the organisers for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. As you can see, my presentation is entitled The Visual Brain, Embodiment, and the First Visual Cultures, what can they tell us about art? Now, the first part of this presentation is going to be about the strategies and techniques that people used during mainly the Upper Paleolithic. And then the second part will be about how these strategies relate to how the visual brain functions. And then I'll go on to show how this also relates to the more recent art, especially abstract art. So to start off with, I'd just like to begin with what I call the earliest passive representations. These I call them passive representations, which will become obvious in a moment, in due course. The first one comes, this one here, it's the Macam Spat pebble from South Africa. It's dated 3 million years ago, and it was picked up by an Australopithecine, and it was transported about 20 kilometers to a cave where it was deposited and found in the early 20th century. And it's thought to have been valued because it's got a superficial resemblance to a face. Now, none of the features on this particular object have been intentionally engraved or curated in any way. It's a purely natural object. So it seems that the Australopithecines valued this object because of its resemblance to a face. The second example here is called the Tantan proto-figurine. It comes from Morocco. It's dated 300 to 400,000 years ago, and it has got one or two engraved lines, but it's essentially a found object because there's been no explicit attempt to modulate it to any great degree, except for the fact that the engraved lines tend to demarcate the main part of the body. The third example comes from Barakat Ram, and it's known as the Barakat Ram figurine. It's from Israel, and it's dated to 200 to 350,000 years ago. And it's similar to the Tantan proto-figurine. It's got one or two engravings to demarcate the main parts of the body. But again, it's what I call passive representation, because no real modelling of the objects is taking place. The other kinds of art, we have to be careful what we mean by art, but it's a shorthand way of referring to these visual cultures. The first example comes from South Africa, and there are these grid-like patterns, repetitive straight lines and intersecting lines, which have been made on ostrich eggshell fragments, and these fragments come from an ostrich eggshell flask, which was thought to be used as a water container. The second example, and these date from about 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. The second example comes from Blombos, and these date from about 77,000 to 100,000 years ago. And we see similar concern for these intersecting lines and repetitive lines. The third example comes from Patna in India. It's dated about 25,000 years ago, and again it's on ostrich eggshell, and it's got these cross motifs which are very similar to the Blombos motifs. And this example here, this grid-like pattern, comes from Lascaux in France, dated about 17,000 years ago, and then coincidentally, and as we saw in the previous presentation, these grid-like patterns has also been discovered in a cave in Gibraltar, which were made by Neanderthals, dated to about 39,000 years ago. This example here comes from India. These are cupules, and this is the kind of cup-shaped indentations made into rocks. intentionally made, and sometimes they come in haphazard patterns, and other times they're in more ordered arrangements. This example here comes from Bildungsleben in Germany. This again is these repetitive straight lines. This has been made on a piece of bone, but not all archaeologists accept the authenticity of these particular pieces. The last example comes from Bulgaria, again a preference for these repetitive lines. Now the graphic strategies that we first see come from various caves in France and Spain, and also we find these representations from Australia and other parts of the world, but I'm concentrating on the European examples here. The first two examples come from Lascaux and Peshmel Cave, and it's the inclusion of these geometric features along with the outlines and silhouettes of animals. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We get these repetitive outlines of animals here for no obvious reason. We get the inclusion of fissures and cracks into the outlines of animals. You can see here along the top outline of this bison. This example here from Comarque Cave is the top part of it are purely natural features, and it's only this part of the animal here around the mouth area which has been intentionally engraved. So that suggests that the hunter-gatherers were going in these caves, were finding these natural features and using those as kind of trigger cues for completing the actual representation. This example here comes from Lascaux, and it shows the twisted perspective which was mentioned earlier on, which is quite common in Paleolithic art. We get these mass superimpositions where you get all these outlines which are superimposed upon one another to such an extent it's very difficult to tell what's being represented. And of course, we get this rhinoceros from Chauvet with this exaggeration of the salient features. And the hybrid figures were human anatomical features and animal features conjoined together. And we also get these, an addiction to this top cervical dorsal line, as it's called, which follows the backbone of the animal. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in a moment. We get lots of handprints and hand stencils. So these are the main strategies, not every strategy, but the main strategies that were used in the first representations. I'd just like to look a little bit more in detail on this particular painting or drawing from Chauvet, dated up to about 35,000 years ago. You see three outlines here of a lion and a lioness, and we can see the similarity between the photograph of the lion with this part of the lion's profile is the only part of the outline which is available. And it seems as though the artists were actually concerned with that particular part of the animal's outline, and that is important for the reasons of survival, because they needed to identify these animals quickly and efficiently and as effectively as possible. We see another lion here in a slightly camouflaged, and we note here the animal's legs and feet area are not included in the representation. We find that quite a lot in Upper Paleolithic art, and that's because invariably those parts of the anatomy are obscured, as we see in these examples here. But we don't, although there's a lot of the emphasis on the cervical dorsal line of animals, we also see lots of what's called the typical profile view of animals, as we see here from Le Portel Cave in France. And but if we look at this illustration here of bison as you would naturally see them in a natural environment, we don't always see the profile view of animals. We see them from all different points of view. But about 96 or 97% of the animals that we see in Upper Paleolithic art are in this prototypical view. And so why is that the case? It may have something to do with the fact that in the visual brain, especially in the left hemisphere, we have neurons which are specifically devoted to encoding the prototypical view, and that's a fast, effective, and easy method for identifying animals for the usual angles of view when we see those particular animals. I don't know whether anybody's noticed, but there's actually a third bison represented here in the middle. Has anybody noticed that? Well, the reason it's quite difficult is because this outline here, there's the top outline of the bison's back, there's its head, there's the underparts. They're quite similar to the undulating contours of the actual cave itself. And these caves are full of these suggestive contours which suggest animals. So that gives us one reason why these representations might look so naturalistic. They seem to have been structured by the material environment in which hunter-gatherers were engaging with that environment, and the environment was suggesting things back to them. So there's a dynamic interaction between the two. Now, I'd just like to talk a bit more about these patterns. This, on the left-hand side here, these are the actual depictions as they would look. And I've taken some of the patterns away to show you the difference between the two representations. Most people seem to prefer these representations because these patterns seem to give a certain sense of energy and intensity to the representations. There's a few studies being done on this that show that people actually do prefer these representations with what I call these distractors. Now, the cave environment is full of these suggestive contours, as I've said, and we see here two examples of a cave environment. These are artificially lit cave environments, but they're typical of the cave environments which hunter-gatherers would have been frequenting. And we see that this is Chauvet Cave, and there's actually another animal represented there. I don't know whether anybody can see this animal. It's actually a mammoth, and there is the top outline, there is the trunk, and there are the underparts. Now, that outline follows the suggestive contours of the actual cave itself. And you've got to take into account when people were going into these caves, they weren't brightly lit like this. They were going down with torch burners and lamps. And those torch burners and flickering flames would have caused the contours to move, giving them a sense of animacy. And so that, again, would seem to bring the interior of the cave alive, give it a sense of this animacy. And we've got to also take into account that when people were going out in hunting forays, they would spend a long time looking at animals and looking for that cervical dorsal line in order to detect predators and prey, which was important for survival. Now, one of the things about a visual system, when it spends a long periods of time concentrating on particular objects, is that it suffers what's called this phenomenon called pseudo-hallucinations. And they especially become prominent, these pseudo-hallucinations, when people go into subdued lighting areas, such as in a cave. So these hunter-gatherers are going out on these hunting forays, having a hyperactive visual system for perceiving animals, coming into the cave with these suggestive cave outlines and the moving profiles. So we get this dynamic interaction between those two criteria. But there's a third criteria, and that is to do with the fact that these caves were already frequented by dangerous predators like lions, cave bears, and other animals. So one of the things about when we sense danger is the emotional brain becomes more active. Because it becomes more active, it makes the visual brain engage in what's called hypothesis testing, and that would increase this ability to see these animal forms in the outlines of the caves. If we look at this, this example here, this is an artist, a British artist called Robert Pepperell, and he deliberately takes Renaissance paintings and he turns them into abstract paintings. And we see the resemblance between the abstract painting with the suggestion of actual features, figurative features, where there's no actual objects represented there. And that's, so artists seem to, well, Robert Pepperell in particular, seems to be playing with this, this dynamic interaction of this suggestion that forms can make to us and the projective process which goes on in the visual brain. Now, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the visual brain and how this relates to some of these strategies. As you see here, the information impinges on the retina and then is sent up to the lateral geniculate nucleus to the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, where it interfaces with the early visual areas, i.e. V1, V2, and then the information is sent through the hierarchy to the temporal cortex, where the visual image is experienced in conscious awareness. I've laid out this hierarchy here, and you can see this is level V1, and V1 specializes for various orientations of line, and these, I call them visual primitives. And as we move up the hierarchy, these visual primitives are put together to form intersections, edges, and slightly more complex lines. And as we go up that visual hierarchy, the more information is put together to make more complex forms until we reach the infratemporal cortex, where the consciously perceived image is experienced. Now, this process that goes on here, the visual processing is broadly automatic, pre-conscious and implicit. But even though it's implicit and pre-conscious, it nevertheless influences the way our preferences for certain kinds of things, especially patterns. And perceptual psychologists have done a lot of work on this. And we have such things as the oblique effect, which is we have a preference for perpendicular and horizontal lines. And there's the radial effect, and there's also the edge effect. So that process that takes place as information goes through that hierarchy takes about, it's fairly rapid, takes about 150 to 200 milliseconds, but nevertheless, there's still those automatic preferences and biases that take place as a function of the early visual cortex. Now, I've been talking about the what pathway here, and there's where the visual primitives are encoded. And as we go up the visual cortex, we get more and more complex imagery where the visual information is interfaces with visual memory and visual imagery, and where we can identify objects. But there's another pathway here. This pathway is called the where-how pathway, and that's important for visual spatial awareness, finding our way around the world, and also when we need to reach out, grasp objects and manipulate them. And then these two pathways, they interact with this pathway here in the motor cortex, and all three of them interact in the parietal area, in an area called as SMG, and the angular gyrus. And that is incredibly important for being able to manipulate and make tools. And those areas are also important for people to produce art, because it brings the blind where-how pathway together with the what pathway for conscious awareness. Now, there's another pathway here to do with the emotional brain, where, so say you were walking along a country path or a forest path, and you came across a sinuous tree root, which had a superficial resemblance to a snake. You'd respond to what's called the minimal cues, and the minimal cues would be the curvature of the actual tree root. Now, that visual input goes to the thalamus and then straight to the amygdala for fast instinctive automatic response to the minimal cues. So there's an almost instantaneous emotional reaction to the perceived stimulus, which creates a reflex action for us to jump back, or it makes the individual freeze. And that's a survival mechanism and a defense mechanism. And there's a powerful feed-forward link to the what pathway for a more considered response to that incoming emotional data, so we can take more strategic action to counter a particular threat. But the important thing to realize here is that that emotional brain is responding to minimal cues. So the minimal cues here would be the curved outline of that particular tree root. So I've been talking about the what pathway, and the what pathway here is particularly important on the left-hand side of the brain, where visual semantics seem to operate. And I was talking about that prototypical view, sideways view of animals, for when we usually interact with objects for everyday purposes, so we can identify and respond to them fairly quickly and efficiently. But there's another pathway which engages the visual system when, for example, information might be more challenging. It may be when objects may be in shadows, camouflage, or in subdued lighting. In that case, we need to take a slow, more considered response by engaging in more hypothesis testing. And that is because the right-hand brain is particularly proficient at this, because it's got what's called a wider searchlight for viewing the world. It's able to cope with 3D shape from motion, so it can rotate objects in the mind's eye, as it were. And it's got other kinds of, it's able to respond to what's called exemplars, which is single instances of an object, which is different to the left side of the brain. And it also sends information, feedback information back to V1 and V1 is particularly good at scrutinizing objects with high acuity. So that all those different pathways come together and function according to the task demands as they're perceived by the visual system. Now, one of the interesting things of the visual system is this ability to fill in through good continuation. And as we see here, that with this Kanita triangle, we see these illusory lines where there's no lines there. They're actually being constructed by the visual brain, so that there's no actual triangle there. So that's an illusion that's created by us. And that is incredibly important for viewing and detecting objects such as a lion or a predator, which might be camouflaged or in compromised lighting conditions. And as we see here, this Dalmatian with all these distractors in this scene, the actual Dalmatian is constructed by the brain. The visual brain constructs these outlines so we can see the Dalmatian. But once we've seen it, it's very difficult to countermand the fact that it's there. We can't not see it after it's been seen, because of the visual brain seems to hone into the objects, because it's important to perceive objects and see objects. Now, I'd just like to talk a little bit about how this relates to more recent art. And we see this example here from Jackson Pollock, entitled Shimmering Substance. And he's got all these distractors, which is like proxy camouflage, but yet we see the hints of a yellow circle here. So he seems to be playing with this same dynamic. And similarly with Kandinsky's works, we get a lot of the suggested forms where there's no actual forms there, and it might be, again, playing with our visual systems by suggesting actual representations when there's none there. So they're quite tantalizing, these abstract paintings. And we saw the Robert Pepperell's work is very similar in this regard. And I would argue that this is what one thing that the visual artists were doing during the Upper Paleolithic. They were seeing these, engaging with these ambiguous situations and trying, and also probably playing with the visual systems. And I'll just talk about that here, where you can see these levels of clarity and ambiguity that you find in Upper Paleolithic. On one extreme, you have these an interest in as much clarity as possible, to the extent that the features are exaggerated. And then at the other extreme, you have these very difficult situations where it's difficult to see what's being represented. And these different levels seem to be part and parcel of what Upper Paleolithic artists were interested in one dimension. And we seem to get the same thing with font, where we have an interest in as much clarity as possible. And at the other end, we have in this font here, we have all these loops, and which are kind of distractors, and it's almost like proxy camouflage. And because of that, but even though it takes longer to disambiguate that script, when we disambiguate it creates more of an interest, because it needs to recruit those other parts of the visual system that I was talking about. And we get a similar kind of thing with Mondrian. His interest in these grid patterns. This is the grid pattern from Lascaux, and this is the pattern I've actually taken the liberty to fill in the colours as they might have looked when they were first produced. We can see the similarity between the Mondrian and the Lascaux painting, and I would argue that's to do with the way the early visual cortex functions and those biases I was talking about, because the early visual cortex is particularly interested in what's called visual primitives, and constructing these simple patterns is the first tag for recognizing and identifying objects in the world. And we get a similar thing with the famous bull's head by Picasso. He's taken various bicycle parts and he's put them together to create this bull's head. And we get the same thing in Paleolithic art, where this natural hole or hollow in the cave and the contours have superficial resemblance to a front-facing deer's head. And these antlers have been engraved here and here to complete the representation. And so again, it's taking these kind of projective system of the human brain, visual brain, which imposes a new representation onto a found object. So what I've been talking about is embodied cognition, and the way the material record structures or scaffolds and the environment structures or scaffolds the way we might think about things, and the way we might respond to it in terms of proactively engaging with the material world. So just to summarize, creating and viewing repetitive lines and pictures arose and depends on the visual system's needs to search for patterns and detect important objects such as predators and prey, which facilitated survival. The ability to depict animals in various formats will have enhanced the ability to detect animals in the wild by promoting fluency in the visual system. What I mean by fluency is that when we engage in visual tasks such as identifying or detecting certain forms, or engaging in drawing skills, that hones or tunes the neurons in the visual system. So when we need to be engaged in the same task again, it becomes easier because these neurons become more efficient at doing that. An artist seems to have commandeered the perceptual and visual spatial systems for their own needs. Although these needs have since been subject to cultural evolution, the underlying neuropsychological and visual perceptual substrates continue to exert an influence. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention. Questions?
I had a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone else? I had a question about the superimpositions. You showed some superimpositions. It's my understanding that a number of the superimpositions were made thousands of years in separation, that through carbon dating, they've discovered that artists put images on top of images that were already there. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, personally, I think that those superimpositions, we have to ask if there's already an observable outline there, even though they were produced later. Why should they want to put another outline onto an existing outline to obscure it? I have my take on this is that these, what's called pseudo-hallucinations, or I refer to them as hyperimages, and this is that the way the visual brain, when it's involved in tasks which involve intense concentration over a long period of time, so the visual brain tends to become hyperactive for those particular kinds of objects. So, and especially if you're going into a subdued lighting conditions and illumination, you would have, one tends to see, more likely to see these hyper images, i.e. that sideways profile view. And one of the interesting things about Upper Paleolithic art is the vast majority of the animals, not just in the Upper Paleolithic, but in other parts of the world, are in this typical viewing profile using the outline. And that suggests to me, especially that they were mainly concerned with the upper profile view, the upper outline, the back outline. If you notice, a lot of the legs and the feet or hooves of the animals are actually missing on lots, or if they're not missing, they're poorly drawn. And that says to me that when people were going into these caves in these subdued lighting conditions, seeing one representation that already been made, and then seeing a hyper image imposed or superimposed upon the existing image, and then they would have wanted to draw that. So over time, you get a series of hyperimages or representations superimposed upon one another. That's one explanation. But I mean, there's also the context of ritual here, you know, because one thing about ritual is when people engage in ritual, they tend to produce the same thing over and over again. You know, and I think we've got to think about, not about art, but visual engaged practices where people were using these practices probably for ritual purposes rather than explicitly for artistic purposes.
You mentioned the sensitivity of the visual system to horizontal and vertical cues. And my impression is that that sensitivity is much greater in populations that live in carpentered environments than
They live in there?
The sensitivity to horizontal and vertical lines. And I'm asking about, my impression is that that sensitivity is greater in populations that live in carpentered environments.
Carpentered environments, oh
than
yes.
it is in populations that live in more natural environments.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's an interesting take on this. the human brain, especially the occipital lobe, V1, where we find those horizontal and vertical lines, is the first part of the human brain which matures. In fact, it's almost mature at birth, V1. And that's because it's the starting point for the development of the visual system, the higher visual system. And you're probably talking about the visual system higher up the visual hierarchy as opposed to the V1. It seems that the processing that goes on in V1 is much more, not exactly innate, but more innately defined, because they found that with children at a very early age respond to vertical and horizontal lines at an early age, and that suggests that the horizontal vertical lines are still important for even people that live in curvilinear environments or more naturally disposed environments. Because there's not just vertical and horizontal lines that are implicated in V1, you also get other orientations, but it's just that V1 has more horizontal neurons for horizontal and vertical lines than the other orientations. And that's because when you look at the natural world, the statistics have shown that there are more horizontal and vertical lines in the natural world. I know it doesn't seem like that because it seems the natural world seems a little bit chaotic, but if you take things like fractals and look at the statistics of the natural array, there's more horizontal and vertical lines. And that's probably why that part of the brain is more innately defined, because it's probably goes back in evolutionary terms quite a long way. But I think it's talking about a slightly different thing, but I hope I've answered your question.
I think we can take one more.
This question relates a little bit to the last one. To what extent can we be sure that brains back then worked the same way that ours do? We read in the modern literature that reading can change the physiology of your brain. London taxi drivers develop particular kinds of brain aspects and so on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
How can we get at that?
It's an interesting question. I think it's because that the brain can be, it can be a little bit like a muscle. And if you exercise one part of it, that the neurons become better and more efficient at that particular task. And if you don't engage in those activities, that part of the brain, it doesn't become so efficient. So I think it's related to that, but I don't think it's going to override the certain evolutionary constants which are important for the human brain to have already imbibed within its system, because that would turn the world into a chaotic. It would be a chaotic world in that case. If those evolutionary constants could be so easily overridden, it would mean that people wouldn't be able to necessarily engage in a coherent way in going about their business in the world.
But how long does it take for the brain to change evolutionarily? Might 40,000 years be long enough?
How long does the brain take to change? It takes, it depends. The brain has been evolving, the human brain, since 3 million years ago, since the Australopithecines, and it's been becoming enlarged. And to think that it started to become reorganized as early as the Australopithecines, and it continues to evolve even now, but the pace of change might depending upon the environment. The environment is very important for whatever happens to anatomy and whatever happens in evolutionary terms. If the environment's changing quickly, the anatomy might need to change quickly. Otherwise, dead meat, you know?
On that charming note.
Thank you.